Hi, welcome to our walkthrough of Coleridge's poems. So just like Wordsworth, you can see, I'm sorry that it's not better, straighter, but digitalizing is sometimes a bit different. So Kubikon, or a vision in a dream, a fragment. This implies that, that the poem is not finished. We're going to see that Coleridge and Keats wrote quite a few fragments, that they started something and never finished it. Some people doubt that this actually is a fragment. Let's talk about the story of Kubla Khan and how it began. So Coleridge was an opium addict. Most of the time, or most people believe that because he had really bad teeth. He had a lot of tooth pain, and opium was the, opioid of its day. It was, laudanum was derived from the opium poppy. It was highly addictive, but it was the most potent painkiller. So he was very addicted to opium, or laudanum, and he had taken a dose because he was in pain, and he had a dream. And this was the dream. Supposedly he had this whole vision, like 300 lines, supposedly, of this poem about Kubla Khan. And when he woke up, he started writing it down. But after he had written a bit, somebody knocked on his door. It was this stranger from Porlock. We don't know who this person is, but he interrupted him, and by the time Coleridge got back to writing, he had forgotten the rest of the poem. Now, many people doubt that this happened. There are just some inaccuracies. Supposedly, he had been studying about Kubla Khan before he had gone to sleep, but the book that he refers to is just this huge tome, and people just didn't have it in their house. So it was very unlikely that he would have this book. So it just seems like he was adding to the myth of this poem. He didn't publish this until 1816, and only when Byron encouraged him to publish it, he was, I guess, kind of unsure about it. So Kubla Khan, of course, is one of the famous Khans. He reigned over Xanadu, and we can see the poet is an iambic tetrameter. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, right? So it does have a regular meter, because we're going to see trimeter and pentameter, and he has lots of irregular iambics, and so they'll have like what we call a feminine ending when it ends on an unstressed syllable. Iambics are supposed to end on a stressed syllable. When a line ends in a stressed syllable, it's called a masculine ending. So there's, lots of irregularity, but again, it's romanticism. You don't have to, stick to anything, right? It is important to note that gardens are symbols of reason at the time that Coleridge writes this, and this first stanza kind of gives us an Eden-like view of this scenery, right? We see that Alf is the river. He's at Sacred River, but there is no River Alf. He made this up. But it's important to note that Alf is short for Alpha, which is the first letter in the alphabet, but it's also reference to God. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So the river, this is the beginning of the river. But some people think this is a metaphor, an allegory almost, for creativity, right? That creativity has a beginning and an ending, right? And that creativity, like this landscape, can bring both pleasure and pain, that it is beautiful, but it can also be violent and chaotic. And so many people want to see that the meaning of this poem, other than it's just a freaky, wonderful, cool poem, is, that Coleridge is really talking about the act of poetic creation, the use of the imagination, and how inspiration doesn't always come. And so you can feel really angry about that. I know there are some English majors in this class, and so you might be writers too, and you know what that is like. If you wait for inspiration, you never get anything done, right? Other things to look at, that this is a dream, and so we shouldn't take it literally. Again, there's a tension between pleasure and beauty, and that tension, it contains elements of violence and chaos, right? In stanza 1, nature is beautiful and bright, but in stanza 2, to the end, nature is violent, it's haunted, it's seething. There are some sexual aspects that we'll look at. And then in terms of that idea of the garden as reason, the start of the poem, we're in that garden, everything is ordered, it's controlled, it's rational. So that relates to the conscious aspect of the human mind. But we end in these icy caverns. And this is supposed to represent the subconscious, which is irrational, it's violent, it's uncontrollable, right? And so again, we see here these two elements. And it's interesting to note that Kubla Khan's palace is smack dab in the middle, right? He doesn't live in one or the other. He seems to want or sees the need for understanding both aspects of life: pleasure, beauty, pain, chaos, right? Let me see here. So the palace is an allegory for creativity. It has no physical reality, and it needs inspiration to recreate. So this palace that he's built, right? One thing that's important, and this is from the Biographia Literaria that I had you read from him, this idea about the willing suspension of disbelief that constitutes poetic faith. That's one of his important lines. This is what he says we have to bring to readings, that we have to suspend willingly. It's not an unconscious act, it's a conscious act of saying, I'm going to go into this poem and I'm not going to necessarily judge it based on what I know is real. Now think about Wordsworth, who says that you should talk about ordinary events. They should be realistic and reasonable, right? This is a very different way of looking at things, right? So, you know, Coleridge really liked that willing suspension of disbelief. He also said that imagination was the creative power that can overcome happiness. And he made a distinction between imagination and fancy. Fancy is just kind of trivial, it's light, it's delightful and all that. And sometimes people want to conflate imagination and fancy in the same, but he says, no, imagination is much more serious, it's deeper. And again, this is very similar to what Wordsworth is talking about, that poetic power to take you out of whatever dire, miserable, unhappy, or depressed thoughts you have, right? And so that is also part of what we see here, right? And so the poet is kind of equal to Kubla Khan in many ways in this poem. So let's look at it, right? In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So we have a little foreshadowing. The sea is sunless, right? So it's starting up here, it's stately as pleasure. We think about pleasure, we'd want to be in the daylight, in the sunny, right? But it's a sunless sea. And then he describes the land, it's Eden-like. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round. And there were gardens bright and with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. So this garden is bound by a wall, it's controlled, it's contained, right? But below this is this chasm, right? It says, but oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover. So it's got the trees, right? The cedarn cover, right? And it's going down the hill. A savage place, as holy and enchanted as air beneath a waning moon, was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. So it's interesting, we have that it's both holy and enchanted, and yet it's haunted, right? So we see this conflict, right? And he says, and from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast, thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced. Amid those swift, half-intermitted bursts, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. So people see a sexual tone here, that you have this woman who's wailing for her lover, and this fountain is spewing forth this fertile river, right? Just like the act of sex, right? So yeah, you can see that if you want or not, right? So he says that it momently throws up the sacred river, right? And then it reaches these caverns, right? And it sinks to this lifeless ocean. So again, think about the dichotomy. The river is fertile up above, you know, but down here it's sunless, it's lifeless. And amidst this tumult, right? So in all of this chaos, Kubla heard from afar ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. Okay, that's physically impossible, right? If you got sun, the caves of ice, I mean, they're going to melt, right? So it's again this conflict, right? And then we have this very, very strange ending, right? And people think that he probably added this later, that if this first part up to the caves of ice is part of that dream that he's recollecting, then this part seems to be then that aspect of him that's trying to recreate this song, but he can't. And so for me, the woman, the damsel with the dulcimer, is like a muse, right? So muses, these are classical Greek, right? There's a muse of poetry, erato, and poets oftentimes invoke muses. This idea that they become these empty vessels that the muse inhabits because humans are incapable of recreating with words certain experiences or events. And they need this divine help of the muse to help them use it, right? So, Shakespeare famously in Henry V says, "Oh, for a muse of fire," and the Iliad starts off with "Sing, O Muse." No, actually, the Aeneid starts off with "Sing, O Muse," right? No, I'm sorry, it is the Iliad. "Sing, O Muse, of the wrath that of Achilles," right? So to me, he's actually maybe referring to me. He's a damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware. Beware his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread. For he on honey dew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. So to me, what this is saying is that he remembers hearing this. The muse has spoken to him. If he could only figure out how he could write, then he could build something as improbable as this pleasure dome with the sunny dome with caves of ice, right? And everyone that saw him really couldn't look at him. He would be so infused with this divine power that he would be almost frightening. Again, that idea of beauty and pleasure and chaos and violence can be, all combined. That the poet can become this transcendent form, right? That he has figuratively drunk the milk of paradise. He's, that could be like ambrosia, right? He's not quite human anymore. And this is that power, right? But he doesn't have it. He says, if I could do this, right? Now we're going to see in other poems, Keats, especially in Ode to a Nightingale, this idea of if only I could recreate nature, right? But I can't. I can only use words, and sometimes words are not enough. So for me, Kubikon is really about the act of creation and the conflict that poets have about being able to sometimes hear and see inside of ourselves so clearly what we want to do, but trying to recreate it, trying to grasp that moment at the time, and then how you go back and get it if you lose it, right? That once it's gone, it's like he says here, I couldn't finish this poem, the inspiration was gone. Okay, so Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This text is 1834, which states that the spelling has been modernized, right? You can see right here, the Ancient Mariner, the A-N-C-Y-E-N-T, the original, the 1798 version was really archaic. He got criticized for that, so in the second edition he kind of revised and he shortened and did some different things. And this is even more modern. Though it is still, got an antique feel to it. It is in iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter in alternating lines. And we do see A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E. We do see a regular rhyme pattern that emerges. This is a lyrical ballad, like the title of the collection. And this is a narrative. So a ballad is usually a folk song that is narrative in nature. Someone is telling the events of something. It's usually about a folk hero or a legend. Oftentimes there's a repeating refrain, and it's oftentimes sung set to music. A lyric is a short poem of emotion, intense emotion, with a very particular rhythm and meter, lyrics to a poem. So this is a lyric ballad. It kind of combines the two. There are many supernatural elements to this. It starts in medias res, which is Greek for in the middle, or Latin for in the middle of things, right? We get the backstory of how he has become this wandering, cursed mariner, right? But it starts when he stops the one man, right? And we don't find out why he has picked this young man until later on, right? So, these three people are going to a wedding, and the mariner comes up to him and he takes hold of one of them. And the guy says, "Hey, why are you stopping me?" Right? And he says, "I gotta go. I'm related to the bridegroom, and I can hear they're having a good time, right?" So, but the mariner keeps holding him. He says, and he starts his tale. There was a ship, right? And he says, "There was a ship," quoth he, and the bride, the wedding guest says, "Hold off, unhand me, graybeard loon. Eftsoons his hand dropped he." So eftsoons is soon, right? But even though he's no longer physically holding the young man there, this glittering eye that he has, right? It just kind of mesmerizes this person. We see several times it's stated that the young man can't but stay and listen to this story. There is a power to the mariner, and this is the supernatural element, right? So we're going to see some similes, some personification. You can find those, just pointing them out. So he's talking about, at first, when they go on the ship, weather's great, they've got good wind, it's sunny, but then all of a sudden the weather changes. There's ice, and so he says ice was here, the ice was there, ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound, or swoon, right? So again, think about, Wordsworth's type of writing, and think about this, right? It cracked, it growled, it roared, it howled. This is very much more passionate. This is one of their differences and one of the criticisms they made against each other, right? Wordsworth said, Coleridge was just too over the top sometimes, and Coleridge says Wordsworth was too dull and pedantic sometimes, right? So the ship is stuck in ice, and then here comes this albatross, right? And it comes through the fog, and it says, "As if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name." And the bird circles around the ship, and all of a sudden the ice breaks up and it splits, and the wind starts blowing, and they're able to get out of this predicament. And so the bird keeps visiting them, and they feed it and they play with it. And, it's a good thing. And then we have this, right? The wedding guest says, because the mariner, obviously his visage has changed. The wedding guest says, "God save the ancient mariner from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so?" And the mariner says, "With my crossbow, I shot the albatross." We're not given any reason why he did so. He never tells us what made him shoot it, right? And so we get to part two. So there's the ending, the first part. This is leading up to here's the problem, right? So at first, the wind is still blowing from behind them from the south. They're going north. That's good, right? And he says, "I had done a hellish thing. It was evil." Right? "And it would work him woe, for all avert I had killed the bird that made the breeze to blow." So now the breeze has stopped blowing, right? Or, no, I'm sorry, it hasn't stopped blowing yet, but they're complaining because, why would you kill the bird? He was helping us, right? So they're criticizing him. But then they agree with him by saying, but that bird also brought fog and mist, and it kind of brought bad weather. So here they've really condemned themselves because they haven't condemned him. They've changed their minds. They said it was right that he would kill such a bird that brought bad things, right? So this is why they eventually have to pay right here, right? So pretty soon there's no breeze, right? And he says, this is an interesting simile that he gives. He says, the ship is so still. The environment is so quiet that it's almost like it looks like a picture, that you would look at it and you would think it was a picture, right? And so they're stuck there for a long time. And then we get one of the most famous lines in literature: water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. So again, all they have is seawater. They can't drink that. They've run through their rations because they're stuck here. And he says, and then the sea even seems to rot, and these slimy things with legs kind of reel and flow upon it, right? And at night, the sea seems to burn with blue and green and white fire. And some of the sailors are dreaming that there's some kind of spirit that is holding us there 9 fathoms below the boat, right? And people weren't talking because their mouths were so dry, and they're so angry at him that they hang the albatross around his neck. So this is where we get this idea that that there's an albatross around my neck, that this is a reference that you've made some kind of foolish mistake, and that it just keeps being thrown in your face, right? So time passes, and he sees something in the distance that's coming toward them from the west, right? And he's trying to tell them, oh, look, 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 it looks like a ship maybe. But he's so dry that he can't say anything, so he bites his arm and drinks his blood before he says, a sail, a sail. And the crew is really happy. They think that they're being saved, right? Yay, yay, But they're like, but they're also confused because how is it moving? Because there's no wind, right? So it gets there and it comes between them and the sun, and there's this prison imagery of these bars that are across it. And the mariner and the crew realize that this is not a regular ship. This is like a ghost ship. It's skeletal. It talks about the ribs, right? And so they see as it comes closer, there are only 2 people on board. And I'm going to say people, right? Not really people. And one is this woman, and her crew is death, right? And she is this nightmare, life in death. So think about that. There is death, which is end, right? Death comes, you're taken away. But life in death is worse because you're still somehow alive. And for the crew, death is going to take them. But for the mariner, he kind of is like life and death. He is cursed to roam and tell this story. He's never going to die, right? And so they're playing dice for the crew's souls, and she wins, right? And so she whistles, I think, 3 times, and the crew are looking at him, and they curse him, right? They curse him with their eyes. And as soon as she does this, all of these 200 men fall down dead, right? One by one. And he says, it's kind of ironic, he says, and every soul it passed me by like the whiz of my crossbow. So as their souls leave their body, whether they're going to heaven or hell, bliss or woe, it was almost like he could feel like every one of them passing him was like being hit by a crossbow. So there's some irony there, right? So now he's alone with all these dead bodies, right? And the raiding guest is going like, I fear you, ancient mariner. I fear your skinny hand. And he's going, don't fear me. I'm not dead. I'm not a ghost. I wasn't killed, but I was alone on this sea. And he says, and never a saint took pity on my soul in agony. And again, the only thing around him are these 1,000 slimy things roiling in the ocean, and the sea is rotting, and all the men are on the rotting deck. But they don't seem to be rotting at this point, right? And here's a really important part. It says, I looked to heaven, tried to pray, but or ever a prayer had gushed, a wicked whisper came and made my heart as dry as dust. So he's trying to pray, but it's not sure if the wicked whisper is coming from him or if it's coming from someone who's still cursing him, but he can't pray. It dries up his heart, right? This is this evil inside of him. So he closes his eyes and he's trying to not even look at these dead men, but he can still feel their eyes on him. And he says, for 7 days and 7 nights, no matter what I did, I could see those eyes cursing me. And yet I didn't die. Hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk in how many days, but he still can't die, right? And so the moon comes out, and the sea, all of a sudden, there are these water snakes. And this is our moment of a turning point in the story. It says, so beyond the shadow of the ship, I watched the water snakes. They moved. So these are these things that he's been looking at, right? They moved in tracks of shining white, and when they reared, the elfish light fell off in hoary flakes. Within the shadow of the ship, I watched their rich attire, blue, glossy green, and velvet black. They coiled and swam, and every track was a flash of golden fire. Oh, happy living things, no tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware. Sure, my kind saint took pity on me, and I blessed them unaware. The same self-moment I could pray, and from my neck so free the albatross fell off and sank like lead into the sea. So remember before he says there was no saint to give me pity, and I couldn't say a prayer. My heart was dry. But as soon as he looks on these things in nature that are not beautiful, that before they're horrible, slimy things, right? And he sees the beauty in them, that they're beautiful, right? There was all of a sudden his heart was gushing with love. And the saint took pity on them. He blessed them unaware. And he, in turn, was given his first, I guess, measure of forgiveness, right? So now he can sleep. He says, oh, it is a gentle thing, beloved from pole to pole, to Mary Queen the praise be given. So this is the Virgin Mary, right? She has sent him into sleep, and while he's sleeping, it starts raining, and he's drinking in, and he's rehydrating, and it's wonderful. And then, he moved, but he couldn't feel his limbs, right? He felt so light. But he heard a roaring wind somewhere, right? It shook the sails. And the wind picks up, and these spirits, they're not evil spirits, but these spirits come down and they possess the bodies of the crew, and the crew get up and they start sailing the ship, right? But they don't speak to him, right? They didn't move their eyes or anything, but they are now working the ropes right alongside him. And of course, now here comes the wedding guest. Like, I'm fearful. He says, be calm. And he says, be calm, thou wedding guest. Was not those souls that fled in pain, which to their courses came again, but a troop of spirits blessed. We're going to eventually find out that they're seraphs that have inhabited these people. So these are not evil spirits or even the original souls of those sailors, right? And he says, and eventually they start singing. And he gives us all these different comparisons about what they're like. Sometimes they're like a single instrument, like a flute. Sometimes they're like a whole orchestra. Sometimes they're like birds. Sometimes it's angelic. Right? And then they stopped. And there's no breeze, but the ship is moving, right? So there's, again, this supernatural element, right? And so now, remember, the sailors thought that spirit below the boat was what was keeping them locked in place. Now, he's saying that the spirit is what's moving them along the ocean. And he keeps going until he gets to a part where all of a sudden the boat stops and it keeps rocking back and forth, kind of like a tug of war. And eventually it breaks free and goes forward, and he is shoved aside and hits his head, and he wounds his head, right? And he says he doesn't know how long he lay kind of swooning, fainting, right? He says, but ere my living life returned, I heard and in my soul discerned two voices in the air. So we have this really odd thing of these two voices. And it's interesting because this indicates, like I said here, a stylistic break that creates a narrative that's more like a script in a play. These voices seem to be omniscient, that they've dropped in, and they seem to have known everything that's happened, right? Because, like, isn't he the guy that shot the albatross? He goes, yeah, but he's done a little penance, and he still has to do more. So they know what's coming up ahead, right? And so he's saying, well, the first voice says, well, how is this ship moving? And so the second voice tells them, right, that the moon controls the ocean, and then there's this angelic force that is driving the ship along. And then all of a sudden they say, fly, brother, fly, we have to go or we're going to be late, right? So I've read different critiques, and it seems to be that some people say that, it's interesting that these spirits have no physical form. All we have is their voice, right? They kind of pop in and they look at him, but they're not captured by this story so much that they have to stay, right? And some people say that this reminds us that though we are reading this story, that this is actually being spoken to the wedding guest by the mariner. So it's supposed to kind of maybe remind us of that this is being told, right? I don't know. It's just kind of a bizarre moment. So the ship keeps going forward, and pretty soon the mariner recognizes landmarks, and he's filled with home, right? And he says, please, please let me not be dreaming. But if I am dreaming, please don't let me wake, right? This is a good thing. I'm close to my country. And he also has hopes that that he'll be able to be absolved of this sin, right? So this is where he turns back and he sees the crew lying flat again, and these seraphs lifting from that, right? And as they go, they wave their hands to him. So this is a much better departure than when the souls of the men departed. Remember, that was like the crossbow, but this one there's a silent music that's singing in his heart. And so this is where he sees the pilot. So a ship's pilot is someone that comes in and guides the ship into the harbor instead of letting whoever's driving the ship do it, because the pilot knows the harbor better. And they have the pilot's boy who's helping row the boat. And then there's the hermit, right? So hermits, if you remember in Tintern Abbey, I don't think I pointed out, but Wordsworth mentioned a hermit. Hermits are these kind of romanticized figures in a lot of romantic literature. It's usually almost always a man. I can't remember a female hermit. He's a figure who has removed himself from the civilized world in order to live in nature and to find harmony with it, to learn and practice a spiritual enlightenment. I kind of think that he's like a yogi in Buddhist literature, in Hindu, people who renounce all worldly goods and live off nature, right? So this particular hermit is a holy man who likes to come in and visit with sailors and to hear about their journeys. And so he's hoping that he'll shrieve, that's absolve his soul of the guilt of killing the Albatross. So sure enough, they're going out there, and as they get to the boat, they're saying, "Wow, it seems to be very strange. There's nobody making a signal to let us know they're coming in." And as they get closer, the pilot wants to turn around. He's really scared, but the hermit says, "No, no, no, keep going." And as soon as they get close to the ship, there's this gigantic cracking sound, and the ship sinks. And the mariner floats, and they grab him and they put him in the boat. And then he takes over rowing, and the pilot's freaking out. And the holy hermit is praying, and the pilot's boy is looking at him saying, like, "Oh, isn't it strange? I didn't know the devil could row the boat." So he thinks it's Satan, right? And when they get back to the shore, the hermit asks him to tell his story. And so the mariner is racked with this pain, and his whole body is in agony, and he is forced to tell his story. And as soon as he told him his story, he was free of the pain, right? And so this is how he knows what his penance is. That final penance is that he is cursed to roam the land from shore to shore until he sees someone who needs him to tell him the story. He doesn't know beforehand who these people is. He'll just look, and somehow he knows that that's the person who needs to hear his story, right? Oh, sorry, I went backwards, I guess. And so he says, I pass like night from land to land. I have strange power of speech. That moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me. To him my tale I teach. So that's what gave him that power to kind of mesmerize that wedding guest. And so, they can hear the wedding party breaking up, and the mariner says goodbye. So this is the moral of the story. It says, "Farewell, farewell. But this I tell to thee, thou wedding guest. He prayeth well who loveth well both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all." Right? This is the moral, right? That you're closer to God when you respect all living creatures, not just the ones that are pretty or helpful, not just the ones that you think are equal to you, right? So you don't think you can just shoot the bird because it's a bird, right? That, this is what's going to give you peace. This is what's going to put you in harmony with it. But you've got to have that love for everything in your nature. And so the mariner disappears, and the wedding guest, he sits in it, says, "He went like one that hath been stunned, and is of sense forlorn. A sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn." So that's important. He's sadder, but he's wiser. So he's probably sadder because he perhaps saw within himself perhaps things that he had done that showed why he was the one that needed to hear the story. But he's wiser. And so that means that he will not make the same mistakes, that he has learned this lesson, right? So again, here it is, the power of poetry to to teach us. We don't have to experience things firsthand to learn to be better, to learn to be in harmony. This is the power of poetry and stories, that we can vicariously experience these things, and so we don't have to make the same mistakes, right? So again, it's a strange poem. I think you can see that nature connection, though I was reading something online and they say that there's no mention of nature. There's no real connection to nature. I'm like, are you kidding? To me, that's, really important. People have tried to find, meaning in the symbology. The one that's most sense is the idea of Christianity, that, he's like on a cross, that the albatross brings good, but he's killed for no good reason, because the man was just evil. That's like a Christ figure. I can't tell you all those. To me, I don't see why people don't see, to me, that very simple story here. He says it right, that you have to love all things, both great and small, all things bright and beautiful, right? The Lord God loves them all. That's the story, and I think that's right in line with that romantic notion of getting back to nature. Right? So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Our next lecture will be on Byron, who is one of my personal favorites, so expect to hear a lot more poetry recited. Have a good evening.